June 5, 1941. Paris, France. The streets of Paris, usually brimming with life, were eerily quiet that summer morning. The once vibrant chatter of market stalls, the hum of bicycles, and the laughter from cafes had fallen silent. Under the heavy burden of occupation, everything felt still, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. It was not the kind of silence born of peace, but one soaked in fear, where the very air seemed thick with the looming threat of discovery. In the shadows, people walked with their heads down, careful not to meet anyone's gaze. The new reality had made them suspicious even of their closest friends. Yet, in the midst of this desolation, a small, modest kitchen remained an unexpected sanctuary. Marie, a quiet, middle-aged woman with auburn hair, looked out through a crack in her kitchen window, her eyes scanning the empty street. The German soldiers patrolling the area did little to reassure her. Her hands, trembling slightly as they worked, had become accustomed to this delicate dance of survival. She had learned over the past year how to slip past the watchful eyes of the soldiers and still offer something of value to those who needed it most, the resistance. She stood at the counter, chopping carrots with methodical precision, the rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the wooden board the only thing that pierced the silence of her kitchen. The soup that bubbled on the stove was meant to be a simple, hearty meal for those who came to her door. But to those resistance fighters, it was much more. It was sustenance, both physical and emotional. The war was not just fought on battlefields and in the skies above, but in every act of defiance. And for the men and women slipping through the cracks of society, who whispered coded messages over plates of soup, it was moments like this that kept their cause alive. The kitchen had been her life's work, a humble affair with chipped plates and mismatched silverware. But now it served a purpose far greater than just feeding those who walked through her door for a warm meal. It had become a secret meeting place for the resistance, a hub for strategizing, for exchanging vital information that would one day lead to the downfall of the occupying forces. The conversations that took place here were never loud, never overt. They were whispered between bites, subtle enough to slip past the ears of any would-be informants. Each piece of information passed was like a small thread in a larger, more dangerous web. Marie had no grand illusions of being a hero. She was not a soldier, nor was she some famed leader in the underground network. But she knew how to serve people. She knew how to make them feel like they mattered in a world where their existence had been all but erased. In that kitchen, they were not soldiers or rebels or spies. They were simply human beings, desperate to hold onto some semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos of war. And for that, they came to her. Her eyes flickered to the corner of the room, where a small ledger lay on a table, its pages filled with names and addresses. These were not just the ordinary names of her customers, but of the brave souls who had come through the door under cover of night, delivering messages wrapped in the crust of a loaf of bread or secret documents hidden in the folds of a coat. Marie's role in all of this had started so innocently, a simple offer of soup to a tired resistance fighter who'd knocked on her door one night, desperate for something warm. But she had quickly become an integral part of their efforts, her kitchen becoming a focal point for those who defied the enemy from the shadows. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the distant sound of footsteps or the faint rustle of the wind against the window, wondering if tonight would be the night they came for her. Every meal she served, every loaf of bread she baked, carried the weight of those thoughts. She knew what would happen if the Germans discovered her role. Her kitchen would become nothing more than a hollow space, her name erased from the record, her life no more than a whisper in a history of violence and loss. Yet she could not stop. She had no other choice. The war had consumed everything around her, but in this small space, she still had something she could control, the power to give people a moment of respite, a brief reprieve from the storm that raged outside. And so, she carried on. Day after day, she worked, cooking, serving, listening. She learned the faces of those who walked through her door, memorized the codes that flowed between them like the ebb and tide of a language only they could understand. Outside, The city continued to suffer under the weight of the occupation. The soldiers moved through the streets like a dark wave, their presence everywhere, in the cafes, in the alleyways, in the train stations. The tension was palpable, thick in the air like smoke that never dissipated. And yet, within the confines of her little kitchen, there was an unspoken understanding. In the smallest, most ordinary of places, acts of rebellion could take root. For a fleeting moment, people could forget the horrors of the world outside and feel like they mattered. That sense of purpose, even in a city overrun with fear, was worth more than just a meal. It was a lifeline. The clock on the wall ticked on, the hands creeping toward noon. Marie wiped her brow with the back of her hand, her eyes flicking to the door. She had just finished another pot of soup when she heard the knock. 3 quick raps. She knew it well. It was one of her regulars, a young man who worked in the underground network, a courier who brought news of the ongoing struggle. His face was pale, his coat tattered from weeks of running, but his eyes, despite the exhaustion, were bright with purpose. He stepped inside and nodded to her, his lips forming a tight smile, the weight of the war pressing down on him as it did on all who fought in silence. Marie handed him a bowl of soup and watched as he devoured it in mere seconds, grateful for the nourishment, yet his mind clearly elsewhere, already moving toward the next task at hand. "You're still doing this, aren't you?" he asked softly, not looking at her, but the ledger on the table. Marie nodded. "I don't know what else to do." He paused, meeting her gaze for a moment. "You're not alone in this. We won't forget." Her heart tightened, a bitter mix of hope and fear rushing through her. She knew that what they were doing, all of them, together, was a long shot. A tiny crack in the wall, but it was a crack nonetheless. And for the first time in a long while, Marie felt the stirrings of something beyond just survival. She felt the stirrings of defiance. But even as she served him another helping, a small seed of doubt began to grow in her chest. For all that she had given, how much longer could she keep this up? How long could they keep their secret hidden from the ever-watchful eyes of the enemy? And what would happen if the walls finally closed in? These were questions she did not have answers to. And perhaps, she feared, they were questions for which she would never have answers. December 14th, 1942. Paris, France. The winter chill had settled over the city, the damp air biting at exposed skin as the muted sunlight barely touched the gray rooftops. Marie sat by the small stove in her kitchen, watching the flames flicker. The soup that simmered on the stove no longer felt like an ordinary meal. It had transformed into something far more significant, a lifeline for those who could still remember what it meant to resist, to fight against the occupation in whatever small way they could. She had never envisioned herself as a symbol of rebellion. But here, in this modest space, she was an unwilling hero, balancing precariously between normality and treason. Every day felt like walking a tightrope. She had learned to be subtle, to hide her fear behind the pretense of normalcy. But every knock at her door, every moment of contact with the resistance, carried with it the weight of danger. Marie had become a part of something larger than herself, an integral thread in a covert web of rebellion that stretched across the city. Her kitchen, once simply a place of warmth and nourishment, had become an underground hub for resistance fighters, for messengers who brought vital information and carried out dangerous tasks in the shadows. Each day, a new face appeared, slipping through her door under the cover of darkness, sharing coded words between bites of soup, passing off intelligence wrapped in the simplest of disguises. Yet, with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. The city had tightened its grip. The Gestapo was everywhere, in the cafes, in the alleys, in the train stations. Their watchful eyes never blinked. Marie knew it was only a matter of time before they began to notice the strange comings and goings from her kitchen. The friendly faces of the resistance now felt like ghosts, passing through her life without leaving a trace. Some of them were more than just familiar faces. They were people she had come to trust, men and women whose lives she had come to care for. But trust was a luxury she could not afford. The price of that trust was rising every day, and Marie was beginning to feel the burden of it. That evening, when the knock came, It was more urgent than usual. 3 quick raps followed by a pause. Marie hesitated before opening the door. The young man standing on the other side was one of the regulars, but his eyes were wide with a kind of fear that she had never seen before. He had always been calm, collected, the kind of person who could blend in with any crowd, someone who had a way of navigating the streets unnoticed. But now, there was a desperation in his gaze, a sense that something had gone terribly wrong. "Marie, we need to move fast," he said, his voice low, almost breathless. Her heart sank. The urgency in his tone was enough to tell her that something had shifted, something dangerous. She stepped aside to let him in, quickly closing the door behind him. "What's happened?" she asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "They found a safe house. One of the courier routes was compromised," he replied. "We need to get this message to the others, but it has to be done quietly. No mistakes." Marie nodded, her mind already working, thinking of the safest route to take, the best way to get the message across without drawing attention. Her hands were steady, but her heart pounded in her chest. She had been a part of the resistance for over a year now, but never had she felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The walls of her home, her kitchen, had become a sanctuary, but now they felt like a trap. She set to work, gathering the materials needed for the message. She carefully folded the papers, hiding them inside the bread crust she had prepared earlier. Each one was a coded message, filled with vital information about troop movements, German patrol routes, and the latest update from the front lines. She had done this before, countless times, but the stakes were higher now. It was no longer just about feeding a hungry fighter or passing along a simple message. This was about survival. This was about saving lives. The young man lingered in the corner, his eyes darting to the window, watching for any sign of movement outside. He was on edge, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a visible tension that made Marie's pulse race faster. "Do you have the route ready?" he asked, as she finished preparing the bread. Marie nodded. "The alley behind the bakery. It's still safe for now." His eyes lingered on her for a moment, and she saw the weight of his gaze, the silent acknowledgement of the risks they were all taking. The tension between them was thick, unspoken. He knew what was at stake, just as she did. "Marie," he said quietly, his voice low and urgent, "if this goes wrong, if they find out, I need you to promise me something." She stopped for a moment, meeting his gaze. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands frozen in mid-motion. She knew what he was about to ask. "Promise me you won't get caught. Promise me you'll run if it comes to that." She didn't answer immediately. The thought of running, of leaving everything behind, her home, her life, was terrifying. But in that moment, it felt like the only choice. It was the only way to survive. "I'll be careful," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The young man nodded and stepped toward the door. He didn't say another word, but the heaviness of his gaze lingered as he left. He disappeared into the night, just another shadow in the darkness. But Marie knew that the night was far from over. She could feel it in the air, the tension hanging heavy like a storm that was about to break. As she cleaned up the remnants of the evening's meal, Marie thought about the path she had taken. It had started so innocently, just a woman trying to feed people in a time of war. But now, every act of kindness, every meal served, had become a dangerous game. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Her kitchen, once a place of peace, had become a battleground of its own, with every meal and every message carrying the weight of life and death. Outside, the cold wind howled through the streets, the sound of distant voices muffled by the thick walls of her home. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the door through which the young man had just disappeared. The quiet was deafening, and for the first time, Marie felt truly alone. She knew that the moment she stepped outside, she would be walking a fine line between survival and betrayal. But there was no turning back now. She had already made her choice. Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock. This time, it came more slowly, deliberately, a different kind of knock. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure who it was, but she knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again. August 25th, 1944. Paris, France. The streets were alive with the sounds of celebration. but Marie felt the weight of the day heavy on her shoulders. The city was finally free, liberated by the Allies after 4 long years of occupation. People crowded the boulevards, cheering, singing, and crying in a frenzy of joy. But amid the frenzy, there was a quiet emptiness in Marie's heart. She stood in her kitchen, looking out the window at the chaos unfolding outside, unable to shake the feeling that something was missing. The city had been reclaimed, but the cost was immeasurable, and the price she had paid, though personal, felt just as costly as the victories being celebrated on the streets. She had watched the city burn under occupation, felt the tremors of every loss, every betrayal, every quiet sacrifice made in the shadows. But now that Paris had been liberated, she found herself asking, was it enough? In the madness of victory, her name, her story, was already slipping through the cracks, buried beneath the celebrations and the grand gestures of those who were finally returning home. The forgotten heroes of the war, those like her, were already becoming ghosts, their contributions overshadowed by the narrative being written by others. Her kitchen, once a bustling heart of resistance, was now silent. The pot of soup that had once simmered for the fighters, for the messengers and the spies, now stood cold on the stove. She could still hear the echoes of the whispers, the soft steps of resistance fighters coming in and out under cover of darkness, the urgency in their voices. But now, all of it seemed distant, like a memory she could hardly grasp. The kitchen that had once been a sanctuary of hope, a place where courage had been quietly nurtured, was now just a room, empty and unremarkable. The city had moved on. The liberation was a cause for celebration, and rightly so. But for Marie, it felt like a hollow victory. The people who had fought beside her, the ones who had passed through her kitchen and shared their lives with her, were now being hailed as heroes. The leaders of the resistance were being celebrated, their names etched into the annals of history. But no one was asking about the women who had kept the fires burning in the kitchens, who had risked everything to feed those who fought for freedom, and who had silently supported the cause in ways that were as essential as any battlefield strategy. Marie's kitchen had fed the spirit of rebellion, but in the afterglow of victory, she felt invisible. Her contribution was being erased, swept aside in the tide of celebration. She picked up a chipped mug from the counter and ran her fingers over the edge, her mind drifting back to those early days of the occupation, when she had first opened her door to a lone resistance fighter, hungry and desperate. She had never imagined that one small act of kindness would lead her here, to this moment where her life had been intertwined with the fate of the city. In her mind, she could still hear the whispers, the coded messages passed in the quiet corners of her kitchen. She had never sought recognition. She had never wanted to be a hero. But now, in the quiet aftermath, she found herself wondering what it had all been for. The door creaked open, pulling Marie from her reverie. It was Jean, one of the resistance leaders who had come to her kitchen many times over the years. He was a familiar face, but today his expression was different. The joy that had accompanied the liberation was absent from his eyes. He stepped into the kitchen, his footsteps heavy, and paused for a moment, his gaze falling on the cold pot of soup.